We're now going to turn our attention to the Gospels themselves, and of course, because I'm a professor, we're going to do some introductory stuff diving into the Gospels before we actually get there, because my goal is to make you wait as long for the events as I can possibly take to make you get there. But it is important to think through both what the Gospels are in terms of genre, as well as how people handle the historical narrative part of what's going on. Because we've talked about the criteria, but there are other historical Jesus scholars who work with what a category that we might call or describe as the characteristic Jesus. Their view is that the way to get your hands around Jesus is to see what the Gospels, as they all work together alongside each other, present as characteristic of who he is. What were the core repetitive traits that you see over and over and over again being emphasized, and that surely, given the fact that the Gospels are this hodgepodge of various tradition streams that are put together in the Gospels, that this characteristic Jesus helps us to get a sense of where he is and kind of what the lodestone points are in relationship to his life and ministry. So alongside the criteria, or with the criteria, some writers, and here I have in mind people like Tom Wright and James Dunn, two very important British historical Jesus writers, will emphasize the characteristic Jesus as a way of getting your hands around Jesus. In fact, even people who pursue the historical Jesus and don't like the criteria oftentimes will say the way to figure out what Jesus is about and to work with who he is to deal with this category of the characteristic Jesus, or what the narratives are emphasizing about him in the biggest picture, in the largest blocks of material that we're talking about. Again, somewhat I think on the premise that the way in which corporate memory will work is it will highlight those features of a person, those big features of a person that they're unlikely to have gotten wrong or to have misrepresented. This means dealing with and taking a cross-section of the tradition that you have in the Gospels, being particularly sensitive to criteria like double dissimilarity, or what's sometimes called continuum, looking for the places where Jesus seems to fit in the middle between what you had in Second Temple Judaism and what you end up getting in the early church. And there are those spots that you can trace in the Jesus tradition in that kind of a way. And so those features contribute in a very significant way to helping us understand who Jesus is. Technically speaking, what I've just described to you is not part of the formal way historical Jesus studies has worked until really the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, as people are wrestling with other ways to come to grips with appreciating who Jesus is. And with the emphasis on Second Temple Judaism and the Second Temple Jewish background, and it's in the way it helps us to understand who Jesus is, these kinds of categories are now opened up for reflection in terms of making a case for who Jesus is. And so that's being done more and more on a regular basis as a result of these kinds of discussions. Not only is that being done, but it's only right that it be done. That was a little double pun in there. Anyway, so as we move through, we're thinking about also sometimes the characteristic Jesus, who will tend to show up as a multiply attested Jesus. We're taking a cross-section of the tradition, and we're seeing how Jesus represents a transition from one kind of Judaism to another. By the way, I make that point to make the point that when Jesus came and did his ministry, he didn't present himself necessarily as coming to present something new. He came and presented himself as the arrival of a long-awaited promise that God had given to his people. So Jesus, in one sense, and you've got to hang in with me on this, Jesus in one sense didn't come with the intention of doing something different and establishing something new. The reason something different and something new was established, at least at a sociological level, is because the original people to whom he came and for whom his message was originally intended rejected him and shoved him out, and he was forced to a certain degree to create something distinct. Now, it is true that Jesus, in issuing the challenges of repentance, did say he had come to put fresh wine in new wineskins. And though there's a sense in which Jesus is, in a discontinuous way, doing something new. But he never presented himself as something other. He presented himself as in line and in continuity with the promises that God had always made and what God had always intended to do, both for Jewish people and for the world. And that's an important part of understanding the kind of direction that we're dealing with. We're always dealing with a Jesus who represents some tension between lines of continuity to the past that reach all the way back to Abraham and lines of discontinuity where he's challenging particularly elements of the tradition and the way it's developed in reaction to the Hellenism, but also at the same time in a way to represent the arrival of the new kind of spirituality that would be built from the heart and within rather than on the basis of law. So those are key parts of the characteristic Jesus, if you will, that we think about as we walk into the particulars of his life. Now, the second thing that we need to consider before we turn our attention to the events is the nature of the gospel genre itself. What is a gospel? And this has also been very much discussed in New Testament circles. There was a long time in which the feeling was that a gospel was kind of its own unique genre. It was of its own class. There's a phrase, sui generis, which means of its own genus. It was unique. But the more people have studied the Gospels and the more they've worked with the Gospels, the more they recognize that there are too many similarities with other ancient genre to leave it there. And the genre that has come in for the most discussion in relationship to the Gospels, not in relationship to the book of Acts, but in relationship to the Gospels, is what is called the Bíos genre, or ancient biography. Now, ancient biography is not like modern biography. Ancient biography stresses two things about a person: what they say and what they do. And the goal is to learn about what they say and what they do so that you might have a better quality of life, that you might learn from what they say and what they do so that you might be, I'm going to put this in church language, you might be formed personally in new ways and that kind of thing. There are lessons to learn. Sometimes it might be negative, sometimes it might be positive, depending on who the character is. But the goal is to emphasize the person's acts and the person's teaching. So you don't go into their family background, their psychological state about how they feel. There isn't much effort to describe physically how they look. Some things that would be natural features of modern biography don't show up in ancient biography at all. Why? Because the goal is different and the intent of the writing is distinct. So the ancient Bíos genre is important to this study. There is a figure named Richard Burridge, he's a New Testament scholar in London, who studied this in detail. He took the Gospels and compared how they were written and how they focused on the main character in ways that is paralleled to other major biographies in the Greco-Roman world. And he showed an array of similarities in terms of how this material worked around Jesus versus these other works, as a way of saying, if an ancient person picked up a gospel and read it, would they be in foreign territory? Would they be, in alien soil? Or would they have some bearings for how the story was being told? And his argument was, no, they'd have bearings for how the story was being told. If they were familiar with the way in which ancients talked about great people, the Gospels plug right into that. That's distinct, by the way, from the book of Acts. The book of Acts is not an ancient Bíos story. It's not the story of one person. It is, and I don't know, the only way I know how to describe this is to use the technical term for it. It is a legitimization document. It is a document that's trying to say, here's why the church is legitimate. In the ancient world, it wasn't what was new that was respected. In the ancient world, it was things that had roots that were respected. So Christianity is the new boy on the block. It looks like it's a new thing. It's fighting for legitimization. Well, the way Luke legitimized it was to say, it may look new, it may feel new, but it actually participates in very old promises. Promises that go back, all the way to Abraham, all the way to the Abrahamic covenant. And it's in continuity with those promises. So even though it looks new and feels new, it's actually old. And not only is it old, it was anticipated by the very way in which God promised that he would do certain things. So Acts is a legitimization document in contrast to Luke, the gospel that's connected to it, which is an ancient Bíos document about Jesus. So that's, in terms of genre, where the Gospels fit in terms of the narratives that we see in the New Testament. The other thing that we see flowing into the Gospels in a very natural way is the kind of way in which character study is emphasized. The character of Jesus is emphasized, which very much is paralleled with the way some characters in the Old Testament are developed and the way they're presented in Jewish historiography of the Hebrew Scriptures. So on the one hand, we have the influence of ancient Bíos coming at us through the Greco-Roman world. On the other hand, we have the influence of Jewish character development and studying biblical heroes, if you will, for what they can teach us about character along the lines of the Hebrew Scripture. And we have this wonderful wedding, if you will, of Greco-Roman features and Jewish features in what we have in the Gospels as a way of telling its story. And so, with the Gospels, we begin with interesting starting points in terms of their differences. The point I'm about to make isn't so much a historical Jesus point, although it plays out that way, as it's an observation about the way the four Gospels themselves function. And it's this. The four Gospels tell the story of Jesus in slightly different ways, and they reflect the choices of the evangelists in how to do this. My contention is that the three Gospels at the start, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell the story of Jesus from the earth up. The point that I'm making here is that we start with categories that we're used to. A baby is born to a family. Or we start with a prophetic ministry of a figure, John the Baptist, pointing to a figure who is to come after him. Okay? If you think about the start of Matthew and Luke, we're in a family setting. Matthew looking at it through the eyes of Joseph, Luke looking at it through the eyes of Mary. But we're looking at a birth, certainly an unusual birth, a virgin birth. That signals something unusual is going on. But we start off with categories that people are used to, and we watch the story of Jesus unfold, and we watch it dawn on people who Jesus is in his fullness. And the story is told from the earth up. That's in contrast to the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John tells the story of Jesus from heaven down. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This is CNN. Okay? That's how your Gospels open up. They open up with this heaven down. We know exactly where the story's going from the very first from the very first verse, rather. And what's interesting about this contrast, and it's an important observation to make, I think it's significant that the Gospels tell the story of Jesus. Three of them tell the story of Jesus from the earth up, and only one of them tells it from heaven down. I think the church has gotten trapped into telling the story of Jesus from heaven down. Not that it's a wrong way to tell the story, but it's not the only way to tell the story. And more importantly, it's not the most important way to tell the story to people who don't know the story. Because for people who don't know the story, everybody's got to go through the same gig. Everybody's got to go through the same path. And that is, no one comes to Jesus or understands who Jesus is this way. They're born, the doctor gives them the swat of life, and the next thing you hear is, wah, 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 Jesus, the second person of the ontological Trinity, wah, wah, wah. No one comes to Jesus with an inherent understanding of his uniqueness. Someone has to sit down and explain to everyone who has the experience who Jesus is and what his uniqueness is all about. And that is always, for the person listening, an earth-up experience. And so the church needs to recover the ability to tell the story from the earth up and to tell the story in such a way that it unfolds for people who it is that Jesus is and how it is that the church thinks that that's who he is. That's what the Gospels try and do, and I would argue that's actually historically how Jesus made his impression on the disciples from the earth up. They didn't get it from the start. They had to watch it unfold for them. And the Gospels do that. That's why the Christology sometimes in the Synoptic Gospels is harder to get your hands around, because you're watching it emerge for the disciples as opposed to them being told and kind of dragged along. What has the church done? The church has fallen in love with the Gospel of John. They love to tell the story from heaven down. Why? Because John does all our heavy lifting for us. And so the point here is that we're dealing with a set of portraits in which the Gospels, the seeming tension or differences between the Gospels, can begin to be understood and appreciated if we appreciate that the Gospels have undertaken different strategies for presenting and opening up who Jesus is. And in the midst of that, we see some of these issues being dealt with in different ways as those doors are being opened up. So it's very, very important to take this gospel genre and understand how it's being unfolded and working as a narrative, how in the case of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, in various ways, it's dawning on people who Jesus is. And it's there where the intersections with the historical Jesus come, because the historical Jesus study is only partially able to corroborate what it is that Jesus is about. But in the midst of those corroborations, there are places where the lines cross between the story being told from heaven up and what it is that historical Jesus studies is designed to say. That model, if you will, for looking at things is how I want to approach the events that we're getting ready to talk about next as we move into the following sections, as we walk through parts of Jesus' ministry and the significance of what it is that they represent. It's the ability to watch, particularly from the standpoint of the disciples, who are telling us the story of Jesus anyway, and who have experienced the impact of the memory of Jesus in how the story is told and how they tell it to us as a way of helping it to unfold for us anew who Jesus is as we watch his uniqueness being put forward. It's that we're going to be looking at in the sessions that lie ahead. It's that we're going to concentrate on, and we'll be doing it in two ways. We'll come alongside and talk about how these events work historically, but we'll also talk a little bit about how these events work narratively, because part of our goal is to show that the lines of difference, that Lessing's ditch between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith, may not be as great as people often portray it.